Hello and good evening. An actual welcome. My name is Karen Wolf, and I'm the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for a really exciting event. So I wanted to point out, I'm going to step away from that microphone a little bit. I wanted to point out that we've just opened a new exhibit today, curated by Dr. Jose Montelongo. Congratulations, Jose, Boundaries of Enlightenment. This exhibit is in the Bromson Room. So we encourage you, after the program, we'll have a reception, and we encourage you to visit the Bromson Room and to see the exhibit, but put your drinks down first, if you would. So, as many of you know, we think hard about our history here at the JCB. The John Carter Brown Library, founded in 1846 with the collections of John Carter Brown, curated by him at his home just right down on Benefit Street, was focused from the very beginning on the early Americas, what he referred to as Americana. This extraordinary library, developed now over a century and a half, a century and 3/4, a century and 83 years, is in many ways a library of colonialism, with all that that entails. It means the power of science and democracy. It means the deep violence of the Atlantic slave trade and of indigenous dispossession. It is all of those things at once. All of those histories are documented here at the JCB and have been the subject of deep research and learning for many, many decades. So it's particularly, I think, important that we begin our reflections around 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the independence of the United States by thinking about what that history means for us as an institution, and by thinking about that context. You will understand why it is that I've been so excited to welcome our speaker tonight. But instead of introducing her formally, I'm going to invite my colleague Kimberly Toney, who is the coordinating curator for Native American and Indigenous collections, jointly appointed here at the JCB and at Brown University Library. Kim.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to be here tonight and to learn next to you all. As Karen offered generously, I'm Kim Toney. I'm coordinating curator for Native and Indigenous materials here at the JCB and also just across the way at the John Hay Library. In this role, I'm constantly thinking about how library collections are built over time, how those materials are described, how knowledge is shared, how knowledge is accessed, and how collections related to, oftentimes about, but not by Native and Indigenous peoples, are stewarded and cared for at colonial institutions. Also, a particular focus of my curatorial work this year has been in engaging with and supporting the new critical Native and Indigenous studies concentration here at Brown, which has included a particular focus on Indian law, politics, and policy, so definitely related to our topic here tonight. Also, as someone whose ancestors are Nipmuc and Narragansett, and here on Narragansett homelands, in a place connected not only to Narragansett, but Wampanoag and Nipmuc communities, past, present, and future, it's so important and meaningful to hear from Native scholars like Maggie Blackhawk. As our communities continue to revitalize, reclaim, and resist, we're privileged also to learn from academics whose brilliant research and writing provide us with the languages, framing, context, and empowerment we all need to articulate what we know to be true about our sovereignty, our histories, and the continued impacts and persistence of American colonialism. Maggie Blackhawk of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, is professor of law at NYU and a prize-winning scholar and teacher of federal Indian law, constitutional law, and legislation. Blackhawk was awarded the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Article Prize, and her research has been published or is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Journal, Supreme Court Review, American Historical Review, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and numerous other publications. Maggie Blackhawk's recent projects have focused on the laws and legal histories of American colonialism and the central role of the American colonial project, including the resistance and advocacy of Native and other colonized peoples in shaping the constitutional law and history of the United States. Her first book project, titled American Colonialism, highlights the centrality of Native nations, Native peoples, and American colonialism to the constitutional law and constitutional history of the United States. The manuscript builds upon her Harvard Law Review article, Federal Indian Law as Paradigm Within Public Law, and aims to bring the study of American colonialism and Native peoples to the fore in broader discussions of American public law. Maggie.
So thank you so much to Kim Tony for that very, very generous introduction. And my sincere thanks also to Karen Wolf and to the John Carter Brown Library and its board for this invitation to speak tonight. I've long been a fan of both this institution, but also its leaders' work. Professor Wolf has been wonderful in developing, establishing, and spreading the idea of vast early America. And in many ways, my talk today, as well as my work more generally, really is an effort to develop the idea of vast early America in the context of constitutional law, history, and theory. So the title of my lecture tonight, and I'm sorry if I'm a little stuffy, if folks in the back stop being able to hear me, just start doing this, and I'll try to speak more loudly. So the title of my lecture tonight is The Constitution of American Colonialism. And on the opening slide is a painting by John Gast titled American Progress. Rendered in 1872, it depicts Manifest Destiny as this beautiful woman with flowing white robes carrying a school book, and at the center of a process that's transforming much of America at the time. These processes of change were central to the shaping, quite literally the shaping, of the United States in the 19th century. But this is rarely an image that you see in relation to American constitutionalism. And I'd like to offer today that the history of American colonialism, something you can really only capture through the lens of vast early America, or perhaps even just vast America, as I'd like to offer, might help us better understand what constitutional law is, and perhaps through that, how better to identify and address matters of constitutional concern, as well as to resolve even modern conflicts. Okay. So this last November, the Harvard Law Review published my foreword. It was the first of its kind. It's to bring questions of American colonialism into conversation with American constitutional law. So the foreword is a state-of-the-field essay, written, invited by a constitutional law scholar each year. In the past, it's been authored by justices of the Supreme Court, as well as the leading lights of American constitutional law and theory. I joke with my colleagues that it was the first time, likely in history, that the foreword resulted in a child being potty trained late. It was an unusual selection. But at its most general level, the Constitution of American Colonialism brings the law and history of American colonialism to bear on U.S. constitutional law, history, and theory. It's a call to the field of constitutional law to better center American colonialism, and in particular, to center the law, history, and perspectives of Native and other colonized peoples. The foreword is long. I'm sorry, a little too long for folks in the room, but I welcome you to read it. And it makes a range of contributions. The genre is really seen as a forum to initiate scholarly conversation rather than to make a singular contribution. But I'd like to highlight some of the novel moves of the foreword tonight, as well as its relationship to the central questions of vast early America. And my hope is to better reveal the ways that a more capacious and inclusive history can reveal our modern constitutional culture as historically contingent, and thus denaturalize our understanding of what the Constitution is and what it is not, and in turn, what we and it might become. Okay, so let's begin with a puzzle, one that the Supreme Court confronted and postponed last summer in Holland v. Brackeen. That is the seemingly irreconcilable collision between the United States Constitution and the laws that regulate American colonialism. In Brackeen, the court was asked to resolve whether the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, in setting adoption and foster placement preferences for Indian children and Indian families violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution by discriminating on the basis of race. The Supreme Court upheld the statute in a 7-2 opinion authored by Justice Coney Barrett. So you can see the justices who joined the majority are highlighted, whereas the dissenters are back in the background in neutral. Exactly, yeah. It's always surprising. So it was actually authored by Justice Barrett, and it was with a moving and brilliant concurrence authored by Justice Gorsuch. Again, always a surprise, and we can talk more about that in Q&A, about the ideological surprises of the topics I study. But the court upheld ICWA by declining to reach the thorniest constitutional challenge to the statute, that of equal protection, and through a ringing affirmance of the plenary power doctrine, which gives Congress plenary power over Native and other colonized peoples. So, the equal protection challenges to federal Indian law were thus left for another day. Keeping alive the threat identified by the Supreme Court in Morton v. Mancari that a, quote, entire title of the United States Code, 25 U.S.C. Indians, would be effectively erased by constitutional challenges of the kind raised in Brackeen. So the result in Brackeen in this last summer is a moment for celebration. But it's also a lesson in how far our elite institutions have to go before they might reckon with American colonialism. So the reality, and I'm not sure if folks can read that, so I'll start to try and read things on the slide. The reality is that the court likely struggled fundamentally to reconcile equality and colonialism as a constitutional matter. From those challenging ICWA on equal protection grounds, so on the right side of the slide, or your left side, the court saw the Constitution. It saw text, precedent, structure, prudence, ethos, honored authority. So for my students in constitutional law, these are the modalities of constitutionalism in full form. These were offered with a range of historical argument. In response, on the right side of the slide, the law's defenders offered the court maybe prudence, a smattering of precedent, but as is the case in many constitutional adjudications in the context of empire, the arguments on the other side were a little non-traditional. The tribal and federal governments defending ICWA argued instead that the typical equal protection doctrine simply didn't apply here. Although the statute regulated Indian children, this classification, they argued, was not suspect because of the, quote, unique relationship between the United States and Indian tribes, as well as longstanding historical practice treating Indians differently because of their political status. There was precedent in support of these non-traditional arguments. The Supreme Court had agreed that distinctive treatment of Indians did not offend the Constitution. But the precedent, Morton v. Mancari, was 50 years old, and it predated the more recent and more stringent constitutional concerns raised by the court over racial classifications. Mancari also drew upon values, histories, and authorities that were not paradigmatically or even recognizably constitutional. A trust obligation, a history of judicial deference, Congress's unique obligation towards the Indians. So what is a congressional obligation in constitutional terms? What is a trust obligation, a unique legal relationship? These were a strained and strange set of constitutional arguments that we've actually seen repeated in a variety of similar forms across jurisdictions colonized by the United States. And the reality is that Brackeen represents, this is going to be very small, a rising tide of confusion and conflict between the Constitution and American colonialism. There are just many Supreme Court opinions up there. That's what you can take away from that slide. So this rising tide in the last 20 years, case after case has gone before the Supreme Court to challenge the laws regulating American colonialism on constitutional grounds. And many of those cases actually present similar puzzles to Brackeen. So just 2 years ago in United States v. Madero, the court resolved an equal protection challenge to differences in welfare spending for Puerto Rico. The same year, in Oklahoma v. Castro Huerta, the court unilaterally extended state criminal jurisdiction into Indian country with a gesture to the 10th Amendment. In 2020, the court resolved in Aurelius whether the Appointments Clause was violated by the appointment of the PROMESA board overseeing Puerto Rico's financial struggles and essentially governing them today. You also have Rice v. Cayetano, U.S. v. Laura. Fidesimanu was a petition for birthright citizenship citizenship for American Samoans. And Sanchez Valle seemingly resolved the recognition status, so whether or not they have sovereignty, of Puerto Rico under the guise of a double jeopardy challenge in 2016. And these are just a few of the cases that have come before the court in recent years. So my lecture today will proceed in 3 parts. First, I'll introduce the law and legal history of American colonialism before turning in part 2 to an explanation of why I believe this legal history should be framed as constitutionalism. And this is where this broader, vast idea of history will hopefully inform this different vision of constitutionalism. And that this constitutionalism is on par with the written constitutionalism that we recognize elsewhere, but it should be more applied, this distinctive constitutionalism, in the context of American empire. And finally, I'll close with a return to this constitutional collision, this puzzle that we started with, between the US Constitution and American colonialism, to suggest ways that these histories, brought together under the frame of colonialism, might help us better understand the United States Constitution and potentially resolve those conflicts. So part 1. So American colonialism, to the extent that it's recognized and studied at all, is generally examined piecemeal. On the slide, you can see the lower 48 depicted with native reservations throughout, as well as our insular territories, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa. But these images that you see on the slides are rarely ever brought together and studied together. They instead fall between specializations, so diplomatic history, native history, international history, as well as they belie traditional divisions of geographies and periods. The laws that regulate these areas are also usually studied in isolation, and they're often described as incoherent, shifting unpredictably with the whims of federal policymakers, and even, and I think inappropriately, called schizophrenic by justices of the Supreme Court. Recently, however, legal historians, Professor Lauren Benton, chief among them, have called for scholars to build a legal history of American colonialism writ large, and to study this legal and constitutional history within the global history of empire and imperial constitutions, to take away that exceptionalism. And so this is, in essence, a vast, or a very vast, constitutional and legal history. And in the foreword, I bring together in a comprehensive way the legal histories of American colonialism over Native peoples, with colonialism over non-Indians during domestic expansion, as well as overseas colonization. And I bring together the legal histories of imperial subordination with those of advocacy, empowerment, and the visions of colonized peoples. So bringing together these vast legal histories under the banner of colonialism was really quite revelatory for me. It was particularly revelatory in the way that it brought to the fore unexpected continuities that could begin to make sense of and simplify these areas of law and history that were often seen as disparate and incoherent. So working more capaciously, allowing the frame of colonialism to come to the fore, offered distinctive forms of periodization. So rather than focus solely on the laws and legal histories of Indian country and the shifting whims of federal policymakers, we can start to understand the interplay of these laws and histories with the broader histories of American colonialism, including Western expansion and colonialism more globally. The foreword focuses on 3 central points in the development of the law of American colonialism, as historians have in the past: the establishment of the Northwest Territory and its governance by the Northwest Ordinance in 1789, the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, and then overseas colonization in the late 19th century. None of these central points tend to make it into constitutional law casebooks, and even fewer than make it into the classrooms themselves, or even the theories on constitutional law. The foreword highlights a range of continuities, but I'll highlight today one example of a continuity that came to the fore under the frame of colonialism. That is the blueprint for empire laid by the Northwest Ordinance that became stable constitutional doctrine applied again and again to further the American colonial project. It was used as a guide during Western expansion for the admission of states. It structured overseas colonization, and it even laid the groundwork for the legal frameworks of self-determination and empowerment that were passed by the Congress for Native and other colonized people into the 20th century. So the Indian Reorganization Act, for folks who are aware of it, as well as the Philippine Independence Act, were actually passed the same year by the same Congress and shared features with the blueprint for empire. So the blueprint for empire predated the founding of the United States Constitution. It is the Constitution written elsewhere. At this time, in addition to creating a doctrine of colonization for a specific people, Indians, that would be written explicitly into all of the founding documents, the United States also began to create a distinctive, these external spaces of colonization that it would call territories. Territories within the early republic were formed around contested jurisdictions, jurisdictions like the Northwest Territory that contained predominantly Indians and Europeans. The blueprint for empire would begin with the exclusion of other European nation states from a geography through treaty cession. In the Northwest Territory through the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and by bringing that territory into the national territorial borders of the United States. Next, the United States would vest all of the power of its executive, usually in order to take possession of that area. And so taking possession was actually a condition under the law of nations to perfect title of those lands through discovery. So these are all legal frameworks. And they would also conquer those areas and govern them militarily. Again, a law of nations concept. These are all legal concepts that folks recognized at the time. So for example, even before the drafting of the United States Constitution, the Confederation Congress began the practice of governing the Northwest Territory through martial law. Then the United States would govern these areas undemocratically and unilaterally, while dangling the possibility of self-government if certain conditions were met. In 1789, the Northwest Ordinance crafted an unrepresentative civil government for the territory, a government not elected by the people but appointed unilaterally. The appointed government would, of course, give way to greater and greater forms of representation based on the free male inhabitants who settled the territory. 5,000 free male inhabitants resulted in an elected assembly and one voting delegate in the Congress. Settlement of the territory by 60,000 free male inhabitants would culminate in statehood. Of course, after Congress reviewed that draft constitution and approved the petition. But representative government really wasn't taken for granted within the blueprint for empire, nor were these territories afforded the ability to alter the constitutional character of the original 13 states. Instead, the ordinance established governing structures that would use federal power to govern and reshape that jurisdiction toward the constitutional character set by the original constitutional order. Governance for the territory, beginning with martial rule and moving toward unilateral, non-representative civil government, was then the pattern of blueprint for empire, then repeated during the acquisition and governance of the Louisiana Territory and then overseas colonization in the late 19th century. So the original blueprint for empire, of course, predated the United States Constitution, but its use continued beyond the founding and interacted in important ways with constitutional developments writ large. In 1803, for example, congressional ratification of a treaty between the United States and France approved the Louisiana Purchase. The United States acquired title to almost 530 million acres of land, nearly doubling the size of the country. It was the first time that those borders had meaningfully changed to reach beyond the Treaty of Paris since the polity had adopted the Constitution. Before this moment, the power to govern Indians and acquire their lands by treaty was seen to arise from the territorial sovereignty of the United States. This was, under the law of nations, a power that presumably stopped at those founding borders and those territories within them. It was at this time that constitutional questions arose as to whether or not the power to colonize would reach beyond those territorial borders, and whether or not the power would apply to non-Indians as well as Indians. As president in 1803, Thomas Jefferson doubted that the national government held the constitutional power to colonize foreign territory or foreign nations beyond the founding borders of the United States without a constitutional amendment to do so. In the case of the Louisiana Territory, these were lands that were governed by non-Indians in the South and Native nations in the North. Amidst negotiations between the United States and France, President Jefferson raised concerns privately that the national government lacked authority to even acquire, by treaty or otherwise, foreign territory or foreign nations. The concern was that bringing these foreign lands into the Republican structure of the United States Constitution would actually dilute the power of the original polity. It would change it, Jefferson lamented. It would change its character entirely. If the national government could bring any foreign territory or nation by simple treaty within the Republican Constitution, it could presumably leverage these treaties or legislation just to bring into the Union England, Ireland, or Holland. The United States had only recently shed itself of colonial rule. How could it consent to a constitution that would allow these foreign states to simply just rejoin the United States through treaty? Jefferson actually prepared multiple drafts of a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would admit the Louisiana Territory, provide citizenship and rights to its white inhabitants on the same footing as other citizens, as well as make explicit that a constitutional amendment would be required to add any additional states from any newly acquired territory into the Union. So for Jefferson, these amendments would properly apply the principles of liberal constitutionalism to resolve the concerns that were raised by the Louisiana Territory. So the powers that the federal government were exercising would be enumerated. It would resolve problems of consent on both sides. It would bring deliberation into the process. And it would use that deliberation and consent to clarify the relationship between the new lands and peoples in the Constitution. But as we know, the amendment process envisioned by Jefferson never took place. Pragmatism pushed Jefferson away from the principles and process that govern the Constitution and toward a constitutionalism that allowed for quotidian treaty law, treaties formed with civilized governments like the French, to incorporate borderlands and essentially restrict citizenship by race. And the blueprint for empire and its distinctive constitutional status didn't actually stop at Jefferson's private reservations raised during the treaty process. Much of the secondary literature just describes it as a private concern, but the Congress itself actually went on further to debate on the floor the power to exercise and colonize these lands and peoples. And rather than resolve these lofty constitutional controversies through Republican constitutional principles, Congress supported unbridled executive and military power, martial law, and force. So on October 31st, 1803, Congress passed a bill allowing the president to, quote, take possession of and occupy the territory and enabling him to use, quote, any part of the Army and Navy to facilitate the occupation and possession of these lands. The bill authorized the executive branch to exercise and direct all the military, civil, and judicial powers exercised by the officers of the existing government. So it took all of our constitutional power and it vested it in the executive over lands, 530 million acres of lands that were larger than the original United States. 5 months later, President Jefferson signed into law an act erecting Louisiana in 2 territories and providing for a temporary government thereof. Is titled "The Law Split the Territory into 2 Jurisdictions," one that was located in the south, which later became the state of Louisiana, which had a civil but unrepresentative government appointed entirely by the President of the United States. And then the northern portion of the Louisiana Territory, which had mostly Indians, was subject to the blueprint for empire and settlement incentives that the Northwest Ordinance provided. So it was difficult to argue for a Republican liberal constitutional rule, temporary or not, that allowed unilateral executive and military power over non-consenting populations. Concerns were met with arguments that the Constitution of the Center simply just didn't apply to foreign lands and peoples, the same arguments that had long justified European colonization writ large. One senator argued for the power to govern Louisiana by conquest. Others, including the territorial governor appointed by Jefferson, argued that the residents of Louisiana were just next to a state of nature and unable to participate in Republican self-government. These foreign territories required instead a doctrine whereby they might pass through varying stages of progress before definite privileges were granted to them. The Louisiana Purchase, as John Quincy Adams and others had feared, set bad precedent. The United States repeated the process again and again as it expanded across North America. Only when the territory was deemed assimilated through the process of settlement and following years and even decades of unilateral federal government would the Congress approve the petition for admission as a state. The Constitution of American colonialism resolved difficult questions of dispossession, incorporation, assimilation, and then statehood through the claim that the Constitution of the Center just didn't apply to the periphery until they became a state. To the extent that reasons were provided at all, this process was rooted in a view that certain peoples were just too foreign or too primitive to engage in self-government, specifically Indians and certain non-Indian residents of these territories. So thus the character of colonized peoples themselves demanded this distinctive constitutionalism. Outside of Indian country, of course, the Constitution of American colonialism was largely accepted as temporary. In the main, settlement of these areas by US citizens, predominantly white, would bring these lands under the auspices of the Constitution. The presence of racialized, non-Anglophone, non-Protestant communities across the West required a certain level of variation in colonial strategies. So federal oversight and territorial government in these areas became a process through which foreign communities could be overwhelmed by settlement, assimilated, or destroyed. The national government withheld statehood from certain territories and instead governed those non-white and non-Protestant states for longer periods than others in order to civilize them into the Union. So Louisiana Territory lands acquired in 1803 became the state of Oklahoma over 100 years later in 1907, and that was after the Congress actually denied a petition by Native peoples trying to hold on to the Indian Territory on the eastern side of Oklahoma, who petitioned for statehood. The state would have been the state of Sequoia, but instead the Congress denied that petition and illegally annexed the eastern part of Oklahoma. The law and legal history of American colonialism should motivate us to rethink a range of constitutional presumptions, including the simple story that we tell ourselves about state primacy in our federal system. The story is ultimately a myth. Only 13 states deliberated and consented to the Constitution. The majority were created by essentially the invasion and unilateral governance of the federal government, a government that was created in the wake of that Constitution rather than created by it. These states were thus brought into the Union without deliberation, agency, or any ability to contribute to a constitutional order with an amendment process that's essentially legendary in the world that can never be met. So beyond dispelling myths about our original constitutional origins, a more capacious view of vast early America and its constitutional culture should also reveal ways that the legal technologies of American colonialism have continued into the present. So the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, or the primary statute that structures the government-to-government relationship between the United States and Native nations today, was passed by that same Congress that drafted the Philippine Independence Act. And these two statutes share features with the Blueprint for Empire in offering forms of recognition and self-determination for colonized peoples under constitutional governments that are overseen by the United States colonial bureaucracy. So they look very much like that oversight process that we had for the states. Okay, constitutionalism. So I suspect in many ways that our current constitutional culture and our Supreme Court can't see American colonialism as a problem of constitutional order because it reflects a view of the Constitution that was actually born in the mid to late 20th century. That is, that we have only a positive, written Constitution that can be derived by a court, or most courts, through interpretation and construction of the written text found within the four corners of the document. The laws of American colonialism were once recognized as a form of constitutional law, and these laws have been erased from modern constitutionalism, a modern constitutionalism that turned away in the 20th century from this dual written and unwritten aspect of constitutional law that had been dominant for much of our history. And they instead turned towards this constitutional positivism, one that we all still embrace and haven't yet broken out of. But this really wasn't always the case, as the work of Jonathan Gnapp, Dan Holzbosch, and others have uncovered. But because we no longer see this thicker sense of constitutionalism, where writtenness is just one aspect of a broader and more complex constitutional order, we no longer see the constitutional law and logics of American colonialism as part of our constitutional set of questions and doctrines. Yet, despite the erasure of those fundamental constitutional structures, laws, and principles from our courts, the legal academy, and much of our mindset, the United States remains an empire today. It continues to exercise those same constitutional powers and legal frameworks to colonize hundreds of governments today. So drawing upon recent work on the international legal history of empire, I situate the United States Constitution in the foreword as sharing features with the dual constitutions of imperial nations across the globe, as well as in conversation with these constitutional discourses worldwide. Like many constitutions of empire during the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States Constitution essentially had two faces, one for the colonized and the other for the colonizing polity. But the Constitution essentially provided those colonizers with the power to govern others, Indians and territories, in spaces of liberal constitutional exception. In these spaces, the national government built that constitution of empire, a vast and intricate web of relationships between the central government and those it colonized. So within this outward-facing or external constitution, American colonialism has thrived throughout U.S. history. Like the tentacles of an octopus, it constructed colonies and the jurisdictions they inhabit as borderlands of the United States. In the foreword, I draw upon Frank Norris's octopus metaphor for the railroads, described by some as the infrastructure of colonialism in the West, as a description also of the constitutional technologies built to facilitate the American colonial project. So the head would build a strong nation state, and then through that liberal constitutionalism, with the power and strategy of that head, then driving the legs that would exercise flexible, plural, and often unlimited power to govern others. So many would like to see the laws of American colonialism as simply unlawful and unconstitutional, expressions of brute state power alone. But I'd like to offer today that the law of American colonialism was always more than brute power. Rather, these laws did adhere to a higher reasoning, to higher principles and higher values, however abhorrent those worldviews and constitutional cultures and values might appear to our modern ears. And colonized peoples advocated for legal and constitutional change in the context of these doctrines, principles, and values. There were distinctive logics behind the exercise of the power to colonize and values toward which the American colonial project aspired. So these were logics that were expressed even in the writings of some of the most revered philosophers of classical constitutional liberalism, Vattel, Locke, and Mill, respectively, as well as others. Each of these men espoused the need for a distinctive form of constitutionalism for certain peoples who would be carved out of those universal liberal rights and values. John Locke in his 1690 treatise on government and Vattel in his highly influential 1758 treatise, The Law of Nations, responded to critics of colonialism with arguments for exceptions for those people from the Law of Nations. Indians were too savage or close to a state of nature to form governments capable of being legally recognized under the Law of Nations, nor could they make claims. Thus, when a conflict arose between the claims of a civilized nation and an uncivilized one, the Law of Nations would resolve those claims against the colonized. No doubt these exceptions were deeply self-interested, instrumental, and pragmatic. So each of these men were involved personally and professionally with the colonial project worldwide. But that self-interest can't reduce these complex, enduring, and recognized theories and doctrines to anything other than the complex constitutional theories that we see in other areas. Visions of liberty, equality, citizenship, the general welfare, separation of power, and more. So the theories and principles that grounded the power to colonize often took the form of a justification for violent dispossession, invasion, and unilateral governance of non-consenting populations considered other or inferior. As father of modern liberalism, John Stuart Mill describes thus far in his work and in this chapter, he's written of the dependencies whose population is in a sufficiently advanced state to be fitted for representative government. But there are others which have not attained that state, and which must, not can, not may, but must, be governed by the dominant country or by persons delegated for that purpose by it. So not only did Mill see a duty to, of course, govern others towards a state of civilization and self-determination, but he also identified administrative government as the best way, and delegations of executive power towards administration as the best way to do it. Over the long 19th century, these theories of an exceptional form of constitutionalism, of course, drove and structured the unwritten aspects of the Constitution of Empire, those aspects forming the legs of the octopus, while the written constitutionalism and its liberal constitutional culture constructed the head. So to provide two examples of these constitutional theories and discourses, the first is the doctrine of discovery and its related concept of terra nullius, found in Vattel and Locke, as well as other writers of the period, and general constitutional discourses writ large. So the doctrine of discovery and its principle of terra nullius, empty lands, allowed civilized or Christian nations to seize the lands of savage peoples as they were considered empty landscapes, devoid of peoples who could make claim upon those homelands. So a painting that you see here is by Albert Beardstadt. It should come as no surprise that the great tradition of the landscape began to dominate American painting in the early 19th century. Like Beardstadt, who turned to the American West in the mid-19th century, these painters focused on depicting North America as a vast, empty, pristine, and virgin landscape, ripe for the plunder and development of the painters' viewers. So these paintings are essentially an aesthetic rendition of the doctrine of discovery and its principles. So although this is a more modern example, and although you can't actually see the beauty of it, this is a painting by First Nations Cree artist Kent Monkman, who among other projects has taken to re-rendering paintings of old American masters like Beers. I'm getting the chuckle, so I know folks have seen his work. It's marvelous. You should see more of it. Only now he brings in the presence and agency of lively, living, and modern Native people. Similarly, Native people throughout US history resisted these doctrines by complying with them. They converted to Christianity. They conformed to civilization standards, for better or for worse, which often included human enslavement. And by arguing with these doctrines, making themselves visible and present, even if misunderstood across these landscapes. Native people even argued from the law of nations to co-create the constitutional doctrines of American colonialism and to mitigate them from their most violent forms. So forcing in the rule of law through, and essentially limiting that violent structure of colonialism through treaties, statutes, litigation, and other forms of legal advocacy. Later in the 19th century, when colonialism itself had shifted globally from less populated lands like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and North America to urban centers like India, the constitutional theory and doctrine around colonialism also shifted accordingly. So you can think about the nadir of American colonialism within the United States in the late 19th century was the nadir of colonialism globally. So here again, you can see John Stuart Mill. He and others argued that these civilized nations essentially had the power and even the duty to govern uncivilized nations towards civilization. These weren't empty places anymore, but there was this idea that we were bringing the world towards civilization through the power to govern others. This, of course, was a process that included exploitation, but the broader principle was one that was justified through civilization. I wish you could see this slide a little larger, but hopefully it makes sense from far. So this is School Begins by Louis Dalrymple, painted in 1899. It captures the way that the civilization discourse around constitutionalism took root and had shape within the United States. You can see in the front row in front of Uncle Sam, who has a school book on self-government, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, as well as right behind them, the many states in the back seats. And then you have Native people by the door. Black Americans, of course, cleaning the schoolhouse, and Chinese individuals are depicted only as just coming to the schoolhouse door. And at the bottom, Uncle Sam is saying to his class, now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you, the states. And remember that in a little while, you'll feel as glad to be here as they are. So again, you can see this process that was essentially, they can see the relationship between these jurisdictions and the idea of expansion and the idea of civilization. The painting also reveals the way that race, racialization, and racial hierarchy took root as an aspect of civilization discourse during this time. So not only were non-Christians essentially uncivilized and savage, now they were biologically and inherently inferior. And of course, that's a wonderful move to make when folks are converting to Christianity and conforming to civilization principles. Of course, now it's a biological basis for it. You can't argue around that one. So in contrast with this, you see discourses around trust and holding states in trust. Here, the trust idea is not only raised by litigants who were defending colonized jurisdictions, here the context of Cuba, but it's recognized by the Supreme Court, for example, in Neely v. Henkel in 1901, the idea that if you are going to exercise the duty to civilize, you're going to have to hold that land in trust for the people that you're civilizing them towards self-determination. You can't do it for just economic exploitation. But the vision of American colonialism as domestic constitutional doctrine essentially began to fade from view in the 20th century. So here you have George Sutherland depicted twice. He was educated at the University of Michigan Law School, and he learned constitutional law from a treatise that cited Vattel and discussed the law of expansion as a form of constitutional inquiry. But around the beginning of the 20th century, all of those treatises of constitutional law began to omit questions of external constitutionalism. This separation was especially influenced by George Sutherland himself, who wrote as an essay as a territorial senator for the territory of Utah, where he also helped break up the Ouray Reservation based on unlimited executive power within the territories. And he wrote an essay on the internal and external powers of the national government, separating those two areas of constitutionalism, one rooted in sovereignty, the other one rooted in the Constitution itself. And then he actually codified that vision of internal, external constitutionalism into law after he was appointed as a justice to the United States Supreme Court, and he drafted Curtis Wright. And Curtis Wright was one of the main opinions that was cited in Brackeen for the power of the United States to colonize Indian country. So erasing the constitutional law of American colonialism was in part the result of theorizing external constitutionalism as a distinct category of constitutionalism. It was also a result of international law breaking off into these international institutions and being professionalized in the 20th century. But for these external visions of constitutionalism, these were areas of law that were left without principle, held separate from the rest of our constitutional culture and discussion, and relegated essentially to the plenary power of the political branches to solve. All of these areas are now subject to the plenary power doctrine. The category of what constitutes external constitutionalism is, of course, still contested today, but it often includes foreign affairs, immigration, war powers, and other exercise of government power over strangers to the Constitution, including American colonialism. So in the foreword, I identify these fields of constitutionalism that were essentially unwritten, informed by the law of nations and its discourses, and have, since their erasure, been left to narrow and shallow constitutional conversation and contestation, if at all. Today, scholars have identified each of these areas of law as spaces of constitutional exception and even constitutional absence. The slide is very small, but under federal Indian law, it's been described as sui generis. Immigration is an area where normal constitutional reasoning does not necessarily apply. The law of the territories is a nearly extra-constitutional zone. Powers of war and exigency are, of course, plenary power. The treaty power is subject to treaty power exceptionalism from certain constitutional limits, and foreign relation law is subject to different and generally more relaxed constitutional constraints than domestic powers. So these next few slides are going to have quite a bit of text on them, but I'm going to use them to illustrate briefly that these areas of law were actually once, they had behind them principles and logics that even the Supreme Court identified and used explicitly to resolve legal disputes. So the doctrines were abhorrent and antiquated, but they provided enough structure to the courts to be able to determine legal conflicts and make decisions. They were driven by reason, logic, and deliberation rather than just deference without principle. So 1823 in Johnson v. McIntosh, we have fierce savages whose occupation was war, leave them in a possession of their country, which was to leave them in a country of wilderness. So you have the doctrine of discovery, the idea of savageness and civilization. 1832, Worcester v. Georgia, the law of nations referenced explicitly. 1889, the Chinese exclusion cases, foreigners of a different race in this country who will not assimilate with us. So this idea of civilization needing to be overseen or kept separate from this other vision of constitutionalism. 1901, Downs v. Bidwell, which is the primary insular case that governed the territories today, where these possessions were inhabited by alien races. The administration of government, again, administration and justice, according to Anglo-Saxon principles, may for a time be impossible. We need a development period. We need a period of federal supervision, maybe forever. Then compare these cases with Trump v. Hawaii, a case applying the plenary power doctrine to the travel ban, to Trump's Muslim travel ban in 2017. Here you have mere deference that's based on practice without reasoning or principle. The plenary power doctrine is not today a constitutional doctrine. Rather, it really represents constitutional silence. It's the absence of constitutional conversation, at least in the courts, and because our legal academy is so obsessed with the courts when it comes to constitutionalism, it means that there's silence in the legal academy also. But we see a similar dynamic in Brackeen. The court just defers to congressional plenary power, but it struggles with any kind of principled limit on that power, as well as erases any understanding of the origins of that constitutional power and the earlier doctrines that governed it. So, of course, Congress's power to legislate with respect to Indians is well established and broad, consistent with that breadth. We just haven't doubted Congress's ability to do these things. Indeed, we've only rarely told them not to. That is the reason for this power to colonize. And we just do this, and we keep doing it, which is great. History and tradition. All right, so you have to take your jokes in colonialism talks where you can get them. Part 3, so our constitutional collision. So let's return finally to our puzzle in Brackeen, now with our vast early or even vast American history in hand. So from the challengers of ICWA, the court saw paradigmatic constitutional authority. The Constitution, text, precedent, structure, prudence, ethos, honored authority. The law's defenders were more creative, and that's creative, for folks who don't know, is a pejorative term in law. Anything creative is a very bad idea, especially in a court. Although they tried mightily to fit their arguments into modern constitutional law frameworks, there always remained this eerie sense that the most important issues were just falling off of the pages of each brief. Yet in Brackeen, as well as a range of cases that address jurisdictions colonized by the United States, there's always a sense that the court does understand these jurisdictions and that these jurisdictions implicate distinctive values and structural issues. But the constitutional argument provided in the opinions generally turns on whether the Constitution applies or it doesn't. And if the Constitution does apply, the courts often bend history and law to craft an exception to their quotidian constitutional doctrines. So anyone who's following, of course, Aurelius, the Supreme Court, very closely, the Supreme Court held that the Appointments Clause did, of course, apply to the Promesa Board that's governing Puerto Rico today, that was unilaterally appointed by the Congress, but not actually gone through, by the President, but not gone through the full process that it needed for constitutional appointment. But the court, in oral argument and even its opinion, expressed concern that the democratically elected body that now governs Puerto Rico would be held unconstitutional as well if they didn't craft this exception for local officers that basically only applies to Puerto Rico. So they know what they're doing, and often in determining that something isn't constitutional law in the context of Indian country or a decision to craft an exception in the context of the territories, it turns implicitly on the concern that we're going to undermine self-determination, that we're going to interfere in these colonized polities and further American colonialism. It essentially has these values that have been debated, shaped, and crafted into law from the political branches since the founding. They seem to have gotten it there. But the values and history of American colonialism actually hasn't, and especially its unwritten constitutional law, hasn't made it into the court and its opinions in decades, at least not as explicit authority, because of this current limited view of what constitutionalism is. And that vision that it exists only within the four corners of the document. So we don't have, we want to colonize people clause, and because of that, the power to colonize people is now within this unwritten space. So I offer today that unearthing this constitutional history and exploring the implications of this distinct constitutional domain, that is the dynamics of constitutional lawmaking and reform in the context of this broader vision of constitutionalism, may have the capacity to reshape our experience of our constitutional present, what is authoritative with respect to that constitutional present, by reshaping what constitutes the Constitution within that present. And it may allow us to better envision a constitutionalism that actually fits with our constitutional past and present. So these histories could also begin a conversation about broader visions of constitutional change. In the foreword, I describe an unwritten constitutionalism that has regulated certain geographies I call borderlands, drawing upon a rich and deep literature within history and ethnic studies. I would love borderlands history to come in conversation with vast early America. They seem to be of common cause, but taking different directions. And I describe in the foreword how we might benefit from the realization that our modern ears may just no longer interpret meaningfully the constitutional discourses of our own past. They instead sound foreign, antiquated, and vestigial. In the foreword, I introduce a range of constitutional principles that have developed over time in the context of American colonialism. These are principles that have been written in the blood and sweat of the advocacy of Native peoples and other colonized people for decades. And they've really been codified into the central doctrines of American colonialism through statute, treaty substitute, and often even court order. In the interest of time, I'll only introduce them here, but I recommend part 2 of the foreword for the curious who might want to learn more about these principles. But you can hear recognition, preservation, self-determination, territorial sovereignty, collaborative lawmaking, and non-intervention. They sound in the law of nations. They sound more like internationalism, but because we have a constitutionalism that doesn't actually address what we owe others, it just focuses on the nationalism side of constitutionalism, we just don't have this language anymore. The Indian Child Welfare Act is actually the one that was at the heart of the Brackeen controversy, embodies these principles of self-determination. In the decades before leading up to the statute, 100,000 Native children, this is just in 1950s, 1960s, not 1850s, 1860s, 25 to 35% of Native children were removed from their families and communities. So this law was really just meant to stop a certain form of family separation that you see in colonialism worldwide. Stripping a nation of its children means that that colonized nation ceases to exist. So the political branches have, in passing laws like ICWA, come to embody and guide lawmaking and interpretation by these principles. However, because our current constitutional culture, practice, and discourse has been narrowed by those developments, the court, and we all, don't recognize this as constitutionalism anymore. So returning to Brackeen, let us imagine for a moment what a more capacious and empirically informed vision of the Constitution would afford the court in better understanding the visions and values on both sides of the dispute, seeing both perspectives as constitutional law and involving higher order values. It allows us to better understand and theorize the structure of our own Constitution as one that's written, unwritten, and written elsewhere, as well as to better understand that constitutional history, rather than disguising that history through creative exceptions to our established constitutional doctrines or by distorting those historical and present realities. And it would allow, my hope, people colonized by the United States to appear and argue their visions, values, and laws directly, and for the Supreme Court, and hopefully all of us, to understand them again. So I'll stop there, but I'll leave us with a few questions on the slide to ponder as we begin to center American colonialism within our constitutional law and theory, and begin to ponder what's left when we disrupt many of the simple myths about who we are, how we formed as a nation, and what we could possibly become. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
I just have a quick question. In your blueprint for empire and the subsequent discussion, I noticed that you did not include the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with Mexico, and which seems, as you were talking, I keep thinking about that in my mind and what that treaty says about so many issues that you raised. So can you share a little bit with us about your thought on why that treaty in that period was not included, and all that territory that we gained, right?
Yes. No, I think that the story of expansion is one that I really just picked one pivotal moment where the constitutional conversation, the constitutional contestation really came to the fore. And it was sad because in many ways the nuances of expansion after that, including Oregon, the Oregon Territory, also fascinating as a constitutional matter of how Texas, the annexation of Texas. Like we end up, Curtis Bradley has this wonderful, who's a legal scholar at the University of Chicago, has a paper on how the fight over the panhandle of Florida essentially may have led to our political question doctrine today, where the Supreme Court won't resolve questions that seem too political. And so we do have an incredibly rich vision of borderlands expansion that I hope to key up with these conversations, but I had to for the sake of brevity. So somebody might read it 152 pages later to focus in on particular moments and to focus in on those pivotal and I think paradigmatic moments. And the one in the Louisiana Territory, I think, really unearthed those conversations for the first time, whereas later, and this is even in the context of overseas colonization, you see these earlier moments just built in as precedent, where the arguments turn from, we can't do this, it's unconstitutional, this is colonialism, this is problematic, oh, but they're savages, we can do it, to, we've done this before, we're not going to give back Louisiana. And that becomes the argument. We've just done this so many times, we can't possibly undo it. So this is our constitutional law and our constitutional culture. And so I picked that one moment as a point of contestation, but that is not to say that there are not many, many others that need deep exploration. So I invite others. Yes, yes. Definitely, yes. And so I was trying to both get the capaciousness of the change along with the bringing something to the surface, because oftentimes you see with and this is something I struggle all the time with the archives, you see certain things brought to the fore during certain periods and then completely erased and subsumed in others. As you can see, even with the plenary power doctrine, if you just looked at our court opinions for the last 100 years, you'd think colonialism just didn't exist. It was just something that happened elsewhere. But there actually are these constitutional conversations within the political branches, of course. But it's yes. To answer your question, I wish I could have done more. You're exactly right. There could have always been more.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you. I would love to ask a lot of questions. I think I just want to ask one right here about terra nullius, if I can go back to that, where you stressed one aspect of it, the idea of underdevelopment of culture and of nature, but I wondered about the extinction narrative and the work that would have done in terms of justifying an idea of images of American nature without the people in it, for instance. Yes. And I wondered whether that was relevant possibly as well to the case that you began with that was about children and about the persistence culturally and physically of Native populations. So anything you would have to say about that, I'd be very grateful.
No, thank you so much for the question, and I think it's a wonderful one that keys up a distinction that I'd like to make that I'm not sure I made very clearly in the talk itself, between the law of nations itself and what becomes a domestic law of constitutional colonialism that are oftentimes distinct but in conversation with each other. And so in the law of nations, of course, there is both of these aspects of it, of terra nullius that has in it the unadulterated lands of savages, but also the idea that savages would become extinct because they aren't, of course, civilized and moving towards civilization. And in the domestic context, you see the savage concept applied to lands that were held by non-Indians and Indians, whereas the extinction concept was really applied to Indians. Whereas others, non-Indians, had a distinctive constitutionalism where they would be subject to some form of oversight that would bring them towards, not through slaughter, but towards development, towards a vision of civilization. And so you can see the distinctions that are made, but of course, in the context of Indian country, over and over again, there was the idea that Native people are just going to disappear. And if they don't disappear, we'll make them disappear, either with gunpowder or with erasure or family separation. And I do think that that's a wonderful point about, and it's one that that I identify at the beginning of the foreword, and one that was really left out of the briefing in Brackeen, was the idea that family separation is a paradigmatic tool of colonialism. And the worry, of course, is that the court in the future, if it gets another challenge, which it may under the context of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, now one challenge is making its way up through the Ninth Circuit, if it gets another one on gaming rather than family separation, how is it, if it can't see colonialism here, how will it ever see it anywhere else? Because of that extinction narrative that isn't just a narrative, it's something that was intentionally applied if it wasn't going to happen naturally. But no, it's a great point, and I think one that hopefully develops that idea of the distinction between what is international, what becomes international law in the law of nations, and this domestic body of colonialism, law of colonialism that exists within the U.S. as well as other jurisdictions. Yes, please.
This was wonderful, and I need to read the whole 162 or whatever pages. One of the things that keeps me awake at night is what I see as a move, a current move, to extend what you've posited as the law of colonialism to us, to the domestic population of the United States. So state governors taking over local school boards, which is Providence is one of those. Sending the National Guard into cities that are experiencing chaos, manufacturing chaos, and then sending the National Guard. This is treating New York City or Chicago the way you treat Wounded Knee or the Philippines. And it scares the heck out of me. And I wondered, does your constitutional argument give us a better way to think about and to argue back against those kinds of moves?
It's a big question, and I think a right one. There are, to answer it directly, do I resolve all of those questions? No. But I hope to bring to the fore, in the forward as well as in the book project, which continues, it's a bit of a mirror image of the forward in working its way and how American colonialism has also worked its way back into the Constitution of the Center. So Indians, of course, is a racial slur and has been used as such. It's in all of our founding documents. It's in the Title 25 of the US Code, but it should really be seen as a legal category like slave. One that carries with it forms of subordination and debilitation. It's one that the United States wanted to apply to the Philippines and parts of the Philippines to be able to separate them out from birthright citizenship, since Native people are carved out from birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. But what I do in the forward and what I hope to at least highlight in the short term, I hope to have more answers in the book for you, but in the short term, I hope to highlight these areas that colonialism has touched, and in many ways, because of this dynamic of erasure and separateness between external and internal constitutionalism, to at least highlight external constitutionalism as areas that need to have tremendous work. That we need to have substantive conversations, not about just who decides between the president or the Congress, who has plenary power, the president or the Congress, or the Supreme Court even. We should instead have a substantive discussion as to how we treat other people. Because in a constitutional order with borders and a polity as flexible and malleable as ours has been, we owe ourselves that deeper constitutional conversation, not just as a question of international law, which it became in the 20th and 21st centuries. We can see how well that's working. But to have instead an internal check on how we treat others who may be us as well. Because in many ways, prisons, there's a wonderful book on prisons coming out of the colonial system, and mass incarceration is actually coming through the FBI, the CIA. Many of these federal apparatuses were actually developed in the context of empire. But we need to think about how we use them, because in federal Indian law, I can find the constitutional conversations because they're often on the floor of the Congress, whereas when we're talking about foreign affairs and the war powers, they're actually confidential. You can't FOIA the constitutional arguments that they're telling themselves to be able to justify it. But the ones that they have gotten their hands on, they do point to the Indian Wars. They do point to guerrilla warfare. They do point to colonization without reflection to justify certain forms of constitutionalism. Because in these areas, if we've done it before, let's keep doing it without reflection as to whether or not that was a good thing to do. So that's the only thing that I can offer. Other than, understanding, for example, that the, Japanese internment, 2 of those 10 camps were on Indian reservations. They hold in detention immigrant families in the same places that they held Apache leaders multi-generationally and without trial as war criminals. These are the same institutions. These are the same material contexts, and they're the same constitutional arguments, and that we need to, as a culture, as a country, especially to call on our legal institutions, to call on our law schools, to call on our legal scholars, to put these things at the heart of constitutionalism rather than have them never taught. All of these areas are not taught. They're seen as marginal and sui generis and just too abstract to theorize.
So, excuse me, fascinating, and I have too many notes to ask about. But I do have sort of one specific one, which is, and you mentioned it, the Indian gaming law. So I see it's sui generis, but it must be a little bit better than that in terms of how do we get it?
Yeah.
Because it seems so counter to a lot of the other pieces that you were talking about, but maybe not.
No, it's interesting. So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the short history in the few seconds I have left, was itself a restriction of tribal sovereignty, and it came as a result of the Supreme Court essentially saying that tribal governments could do anything they wanted in the context of gaming. And so the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, like many statutes passed during the self-determination era, set the framework of collaborative lawmaking between state governments and tribal governments. It forced them to the table, sort of like unions, and it forced them to compact and contract in particular ways over tribal governments within their jurisdictions, because the Congress understood that this sovereign power is going to have implications for the states, that the states are going to be upset in different ways. And so, like the national government is wont to do in its federalism, it sets the terms of collaborative lawmaking in that federalism. But it actually matches very closely the idea of collaborative lawmaking and consent that you see across colonial jurisdictions. The idea that we sit down with colonized jurisdictions to be able to make the laws that then govern them, that they need to be collaborative, they need to be in conversation with all of those involved, including state governments. Does it involve gaming and we don't like gaming? Yes. Is it a form of economic development that people who are marginalized and don't have well and established access to capital, where business doesn't want to go in because they can't even understand what's happening because it involves people of color, because the legal systems are incoherent and problematic? Yes. But it's a great place to go in if you're someone on the margins who needs to be able to make money. Because most tribal governments, even the ones with casinos, the casinos are themselves owned and operated by the tribal government, so all the money goes into basic, what is that called? So essentially socialized government, where there's energy, jobs, health insurance, Head Start, elder care, a basic income, what is that? The format of universal basic income. We call them per caps in Indian country. But essentially you have a wraparound system where governments are supporting their tribal members through it. And it's the only form of economic development that really has been structured and sanctioned because it just came first. And do we need others? Desperately so. Desperately so, and I think green energy and other forms of development have happened within Indian country, but it would be wonderful to have a similar sanction of those industries.
Maggie, I think we have to thank you and then ask everyone to join us, first of all, in thanking Maggie, but then secondly, join us for this reception.